Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Consumers are being warned that food could become much more expensive in the UK after Brexit if a trade agreement isn't reached. That's according to a new House of Lords report. The committee says that the tariff on imports is likely to rise and that it had no doubts that this would lead to price increases at the checkout. Our environment correspondent Claire Marshall has the details.
Half the food we eat is imported. 30% of this comes from the European Union. The UK is now negotiating its own trade deals, but it's not clear what the terms will be. According to the Lords report, if there is no agreement, there could be severe price rises for shoppers.
If we applied the equivalent of European tariffs, then on average that's some 22% on food prices that are imported. Now, not all of that would go on food prices itself, but it obviously would have a major effect on the price of food.
The report also warns that if there's no trade agreement, we could see more scenes like this. It advises there isn't the staff, IT systems or infrastructure. Britain's ports could be choked. We went to a truck stop near Chippenham in Wiltshire. At the moment, a 2-minute delay at customs leads to a 17-mile tailback. Now, it does seem at least a few more checks will be needed. Does that worry truckers here?
We need a bit of common sense back in the haulage industry, and I'm hoping now with Brexit we might get some common sense around the rules that are already in place.
Are you worried about changing rules then?
No, not at all. Won't make any difference whatsoever. The rules that are here now will still be here.
I think it's just all going to be done online and things like that. I don't think as a driver you'll see much change really.
The Department for the Environment says it's considering how it will best manage border checks and controls without impacting the smooth flow of trade. It will respond to the report in due course. Claire Marshall, BBC News.
Theresa May is chairing a meeting of the Brexit subcommittee. It comes as peers are warning that prices will rise if the government fails to secure a free trade deal with the European Union. Well, the government suffered its 14th defeat over Brexit this week in the House of Lords. And joining me from Westminster to discuss this are the pro-EU Liberal Democrat Peer Lord Newby and Leave supporter Tom Slater. He's the deputy editor of the online current affairs publication Spiked. Tom, I'd like to start with you. Nearly 2 years after this referendum, and the government doesn't seem to have a position on the customs union.
No, it's frankly incredible. And I think that what we've been seeing, particularly over the past week, is the fact that none of the political parties seem to be able to get their head round this, mainly because I think none of them campaigned for this result and none of them truly believe in it. But I think the most pressing question this week, following the 14 defeats of the government in the House of Lords, is the fact that one of the most clear and present threats to Brexit at the moment comes from the unelected section of our parliament. And I think the fact that a 17.4 million historic strong vote for sovereignty is being thwarted by people whose only claim to have more power and influence is just the influence and friends that they've amassed over their years is pretty shocking and shows that aside from the kind of political headaches that the parties in the Commons are having, I think it's really demonstrated that the Lords, it's finally time for this anti-democratic throwback to be put out to pasture. That's one of the most clear and present threats right now.
OK, Lord Newby, what do you say to Tom's assertion there that a lot of people say 14 defeats by a body that's not even elected?
Well, it's never been elected. We tried as Liberal Democrats in government to get it elected, and people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and David Davis thwarted us. It's rather ironic that they now grumble that we're not elected, but the truth is that we're not thwarting anything. The House of Lords is not the deciding chamber. The House of Commons decides what happens to legislation at the end of the day. We disagree with elements of this bill. We've sent them back to the Commons. The Commons has got to reconsider them. If at the end of the day they decide to reject them all, they will all be rejected.
Tom, what do you say to that? They won't have the final say. It will be people who have been elected.
Well, that's just fundamentally nonsense, and it misrepresents the role that the House of Lords plays, because when the House of Lords wants to flex its muscles, it basically turns the issue of politics and policy into a conversation between the elected chamber and the unelected chamber. It turns it into a game of ping-pong and horse trading, in which the interests of the people are completely sidelined. And the Lords who have backed these anti-Brexit amendments know exactly what it is that they're doing. They're trying to give cover to the MPs in the Commons to try and undermine that democratic vote, despite the fact that voters have made their own views 100% clear. And on that question, the question that I would ask His Lordship, the question that I would ask Lord Ali, who was behind the Labour EEA amendment, which also passed, is how many of those people, how many people in the British public voted for you ever? And the answer is 0. And yet you are now taking on a role to water down Brexit, if not thwart it entirely. And I think that just goes to show, proves what Thomas Paine said all that time ago, that the House of Lords is the remnants of aristocratic tyranny. And I think we're seeing that play out perfectly over these last couple of weeks.
Lord Newby, your response to that?
Well, it's just not true, is it? I have great sympathy with my forebears, but whatever they were, when they were miners and quarry workers and shop workers, they certainly weren't aristocrats. And I'm afraid it's just not true that we thwart anything. The Commons decides. We will finish with the bill next week. The following week, the Commons has the opportunity, if the government schedules it, to vote down everything we've done. It comes back to the Lords. There'll be a short period of ping-pong, but at the end of the day, if the Commons digs its heels in, it wins on everything. We don't thwart a thing.
So then what is the role of the Lords?
The role of the Lords, the historic role of the House of Lords, is to scrutinise legislation, to look at it, and if we think it can be improved or changed, send it back to the Commons and say, have another look at it.
Which is, in effect, unelected people having an influence on legislation.
Well, we have that influence, and we are unelected. We would like to make the House of Lords elected. There are two options if you don't like what you've got now. You can either elect the House of Lords, or you can abolish it. As long as it's here, though, as long as it's part of the Constitution, we're not just going to sort of roll away because some people don't like the decisions we take. We're going to do what we believe is right, because that's why we're in the House of Lords in the first place.
So this is incredible. So you're saying that you want the House of Lords to be reformed, you want it to be elected, perhaps even abolished, but while it's here, you'll use it to do things that you want that the public don't. And I think the fact that the Liberal Democrats are one of the parties fronting this revolt in the Lords is pretty fantastic from my perspective, because of the fact that Liberal Democrats currently have 12 MPs and 93 peers. And I think this idea that you're scrutinising legislation, you're not. You're second-guessing the decision, the verdict that was given by the British people to leave the single market and the customs union, to leave the European Union. And I've got news for you, because the more you carry on like this, it's not just bad news for Brexit in the short term or Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn, it's bad news for yourselves, because there's already a petition going up calling for a referendum to abolish the Lords entirely. And I dare say if that referendum ever does happen, and I hope it does, it's going to deliver a result that you won't like, as well as the European referendum result that you didn't like and are currently trying to thwart.
Well, we're Democrats. If the people decide they don't want a House of Lords, that's up to them. But at the moment, the parties did not fight the last election on abolishing the House of Lords. They fought it on the basis that we continue. And indeed, when we tried to make it democratic, Labour and many Tory rebels, including most of the Brexiters, said, no, we don't want it to be elected, we prefer it as it is. So it's just a bit rich now that we're saying things they don't like to claim that we're somehow undermining the Constitution. It's just not true. We're part of the Constitution. You want to change it? Change it. But while we're here, don't expect us not to perform the role that we've been put in there to do.
Well, I'm not here to answer on behalf of Conservative newspapers, politicians who are, as you say, suddenly piping up about the House of Lords. I've always been for abolishing it, as has Spike for the entire time that we've existed. I'm just saying you cannot claim to be a Democrat if everything that you are doing with the power that is given to you, despite being completely unaccountable, is trying to soften up the largest democratic mandate in our history. You can spin it whatever way you want. You can make as many appeals to your previous positions on the House of Lords. The fact remains that no longer washes when you are using that power that you claim to disagree with to try and thwart the biggest vote in our history. That's just not going to wash.
Tom, Lord Newby, let's talk about substance. Jeremy Corbyn says these negotiations are in a shambles, and yet Labour haven't really said what they think about the customs union, have they? So let me ask you, Tom, you first. Do you think we should stay in the customs union?
I don't think we should stay in the customs union for the simple reason that when people voted to leave the European Union, the slogan was take back control. The #1 reason given in the Ashcroft polls after the vote was that Leaver's #1 concern was sovereignty, and how you trade with other nations is a fundamental sovereign issue which we would have no control over if we were in the customs union. And I think the other thing quickly that we have to recognise about just staying in the customs union, which is being presented by many people as a kind of compromise at the moment, particularly by Labour, is that it's no such thing. Being a member of the customs union and not being a member of the EU would mean even less control over our trade as we currently have. The reason that they're proposing it is because people recognise that that is a deal that looks so terrible, it reopens the case for bouncing us back into the European Union in the first place. So I think not only is a customs union against the spirit of the Brexit vote, at the same time it's quite a cynical ploy given how unattractive an option it is to try and reopen the question of EU membership itself.
Lord Newby, customs union, in or out?
Well, if we're coming out of the EU, we should certainly be in the customs union, because otherwise all our manufacturing sector is going to be at a huge disadvantage. And if we're outside the customs union, you can't avoid a hard border on the Irish border, which everybody, including the government, says they want to do. But you've got to be in a customs union to avoid the need for customs checks.
OK, Lord Newby, Tom Slater, thank you both.